The stars had always been calling to humanity, and for thousands of years, people looked up at the night sky and wondered what secrets were hiding in the darkness between the lights. And now, after centuries of dreaming and working and hoping, they were finally ready to find out. Captain Kim Dae-sung stood on the bridge of the USS Horizon and watched the vast emptiness of space stretch out before him, and his heart was pounding in his chest because this was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life, and he could barely contain his excitement. Horizon was not alone in this journey, and two other ships flew beside it, and they were called the Meridian and the Discovery, and together they formed humanity's first interstellar exploration fleet, and they carried the hopes and dreams of 8 billion people. Lieutenant Park Yuna sat at her station, and her fingers moved quickly across the controls as she monitored the communication systems. And she was young and brilliant, and she had been chosen for this mission because she was one of the best linguists on Earth. The fleet had been traveling for months, and they had left their home system behind and ventured into the unknown, and every day brought new wonders and new discoveries. And the crew felt like pioneers exploring a new frontier. Dae-sung walked around the bridge and checked on each of his crew members, and he knew them all by name, and he cared about each one of them like family, and he had promised himself that he would bring them all home safely. Dr. No Hyman worked in the medical bay, and she was preparing for the possibility of meeting alien life, and she had studied every theory and every paper about what extraterrestrial beings might look like, and she was ready for anything. Engineer Bae Sung-jin monitored the engines and made sure everything was running smoothly, and he loved his ship like it was a living thing, and he talked to it sometimes when no one was listening, and he believed it talked. Back the day, everything changed, started like any other day, and the crew went about their routines, and they had no idea that their lives were about to be torn apart, and that nothing would ever be the same again. Yuna was the first to notice the strange readings on her sensors, and she stared at her screen with wide eyes, and her mouth fell open because she was seeing something that should have been impossible. Captain, she said, and her voice was shaking with excitement and disbelief, and she turned to look at Dae-sung with tears forming in her eyes. I am detecting ships, sir, and there are hundreds of them, and they are not human. The bridge fell silent, and every crew member stopped what they were doing, and they all turned to look at the main view screen, and they saw the alien fleet appearing out of the darkness like ghosts materializing from nothing. Dae-sung felt his breath catch in his throat, and he walked slowly toward the screen, and he counted the ships one by one, and he stopped when he reached 200 because his mouth had gone dry and his hands were trembling. Alien vessels were massive, and they were shaped like nothing humanity had ever imagined, and they had curves and angles that seemed to defy physics, and they glowed with strange lights that pulsed like heartbeats. This is it, whispered Dae-sung, and his voice was filled with wonder and awe, and he felt tears streaming down his face, because this was the moment humanity had been waiting for since the first cave dweller looked up at the stars on the bridge of the alien flagship. High Counselor Vian watched the tiny human ships with cold, emotionless eyes, and he had ruled the Galactic Council for 300 years, and he had seen many primitive species try to reach the stars. His advisors stood around him, and they showed him data about the human vessels, and they told him about the weak weapons and the primitive technology and the pathetic shields, and Viren felt nothing but contempt for these creatures. Council had ruled this region of space for 12,000 years, and they had conquered hundreds of species and enslaved millions of beings, and they did not tolerate any challenge to their power, no matter how small. What should we do with them? Asked one of the advisors, and he was a tall, thin creature with 4 arms and eyes that never blinked. Vrin did not hesitate, and he did not consider diplomacy, and he did not think about the lives he was about to end, and he simply gave the order. That would change the course of galactic history. Destroy them, he said, and his voice was flat and uncaring, and he turned away from the screen because he had already lost interest in these insignificant beings. Back on the horizon, Daesung was preparing to send a message of peace and friendship, and he had practiced this speech 1,000 times, and he knew exactly what he wanted to say this. As Captain Kim Daesung of the Earth vessel Horizon, he began, and his voice was warm and welcoming, and he smiled as he spoke because he wanted the aliens to know that humanity came as friends. We come in peace, and we seek only friendship and understanding, and we bring greetings from the people of Earth, and we hope that this day will mark the beginning of a beautiful relationship between our species. The words had barely left his mouth when the first plasma bolt slammed into the meridian and the ship exploded in a massive fireball, and 47 humans died in an instant without ever knowing what had happened. Yuna screamed, and Daesung stumbled backward, and the bridge erupted in chaos as alarms blared and lights flashed, and everyone tried to understand what was happening. Discovery tried to run, but it was too slow, and the alien weapons tore through its hull like it was made of paper, and 61 more humans died as their ship was ripped apart around them. Daesung watched his friends die, and he felt something break inside him, and the wonder and excitement he had felt just moments ago turned to ash in his mouth and was replaced by horror and grief and rage. "Get us out of here," he shouted, and his voice was rough with emotion, and the helmsman responded immediately, and the horizon shot forward into the darkness. The alien weapons reached for them, and plasma bolts streaked past the ship, and the hull shook with near misses. But the horizon was fast, and it was lucky, and it escaped into the void. Yuna was crying, but she kept working, and she recorded everything, and she made sure that every piece of data was transmitted back to Earth, because the people needed to know what had happened here. Behind them, the wreckage of the Meridian and the Discovery drifted through space, and the bodies of 108 humans floated among the debris, and they had come so far only to be murdered by those they had hoped to befriend. The journey back to Earth was long and silent, and the crew of the Horizon barely spoke, and they were haunted by what they had seen and what they had lost, and they knew that nothing would ever be the same when they finally reached home. The whole world was watching, and the footage was broadcast everywhere, and billions of people saw the unprovoked attack, and they saw their people die, and they felt something dark and powerful stir in their hearts. President Cho Hyun-woo stood before the United Nations, and his face was hard, and his eyes were cold, and he spoke with a voice that carried the fury of all humanity. "They came in peace," he said, "and they carried gifts and messages of friendship, and they wanted nothing more than to say hello and shake hands, and they were murdered for it." The president paused, and he looked into the cameras, and he made a promise that would echo through history. "We sent them our dreamers and our poets and our scientists, and we sent them with open hands and open hearts. Now we will send them something else. Now we will send them our warriors." 3 years of silence followed the massacre, and the galaxy forgot about the primitive humans who had dared to venture into Council space, and High Counselor Viorn received praise and awards for eliminating a potential threat before it could grow. Council members told jokes about the weak little creatures at their fancy parties, and they laughed about how easily the human ships had been destroyed, and they congratulated themselves on their wisdom and their power. But on Earth, something incredible was happening, and it was something that would shake the very foundations of the universe and change the balance of power. Forever, every nation on the planet had come together in a way that had never happened before in human history, and old enemies became allies overnight, and ancient grudges were forgotten and buried because there was something more important. Now Revenge Admiral Baek Jisoo stood in a massive underground facility hidden beneath the Rocky Mountains, and she watched hundreds of workers building ships that were unlike anything humanity had ever created before. Admiral was a small woman with short gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, and she had spent her entire life in the military, and she had never lost a battle. And she did not intend to start now. She walked through the construction bay and looked at the half-finished warships that towered above her, And she felt pride swelling in her chest because these ships were going to change everything. Dr. Lee. Minho worked in a secret laboratory deep beneath the ocean, and he had not slept properly in months because he was trying to solve the most important problem in human history. Aliens had faster than light travel and humanity did not, and without this technology, they would never be able to reach council space, and they would never be able to make the aliens pay for what they had done. Minho stared at his calculations and his eyes burned from exhaustion, and his hand shook from too much coffee. But he refused to stop because the fate of humanity depended on him. His team watched him work with a mixture of exhaustion and admiration, and they had followed him into this underground bunker, and they had given up everything to help him succeed. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning, and Minho was so tired he almost missed it. And then he saw the numbers align, and his heart nearly stopped, and he let out a cry of triumph that echoed through the laboratory. He had done it, and he had cracked the secret of faster than light travel, and he had achieved in 18 months what the council scientists had needed 300 years to accomplish. That was the thing about humans that the galaxy did not understand, and when they were angry and focused and determined, they could achieve miracles, and they could bend the laws of physics to their will. Factories all over the world ran 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, and they produced weapons and engines and armor and systems at a pace that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier in China. Massive shipyards rose from the ground almost overnight, and thousands of workers labored around the clock, and they built the hulls of warships that would carry humanity's vengeance to the stars. In Russia, brilliant engineers designed weapons that could punch through alien shields, and they tested them in frozen wastelands, and they made them stronger and deadlier with each passing week. In America, scientists developed new materials and new technologies, and they shared everything with their allies because there were no more secrets, and there was only the mission. In Europe, military strategists studied the alien fleet formations, and they developed counter-tactics. And they ran millions of simulations until they knew exactly how to defeat an enemy that thought itself invincible. In Africa and South America and Australia and Asia and everywhere else on the planet, people worked and trained and prepared, and they did it with fire in their hearts and steel in their spines. President Cho Hyun-woo visited the main construction facility, and he walked among the towering warships, and he ran his hand along the cold metal hull of a vessel that would soon bring death to those who had murdered his people. Admiral Beak walked beside him, and she answered his questions, and she showed him the progress they had made, and she could see the satisfaction in his eyes. How many ships, he asked, and his voice was quiet. But there was something dangerous lurking beneath the calm surface. 212 combat-ready vessels, she replied, and the president nodded slowly as he absorbed this information. But, sir, she said, and she stopped walking and turned to face him with something like a smile on her weathered face. This is only the first wave. Cho looked at her with surprise, and she continued speaking, and her words sent a chill down his spine. Second fleet will be ready in 8 months, and the third fleet will be ready 6 months after that, and we already have plans for a fourth and fifth and sixth fleet. The president felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, and it was satisfaction, and it was justice, and it was the knowledge that humanity would never be caught unprepared again. What are your orders, sir? Asked the admiral, and she stood at attention and waited for the words that would set everything in motion. Cho thought about the meridian exploding, and he thought about the Discovery being torn apart, and he thought about the 47 people and the 61 people and all the dreams that had died with them. Send the first wave, he said, and his voice was steady and certain, and there was no hesitation and no doubt. Admiral Beak saluted, and she felt the same cold satisfaction because she had known people on those ships, and she had carried their memory in her heart for 3 years. And when they asked for mercy, said the president, and his eyes were hard and unforgiving, tell them we are just getting started. The order went out, and the first fleet powered up, and 212 warships prepared to jump into the unknown, and every crew member knew they might not come back, but none of them cared. Captain Kim Dae-sung stood on the bridge of his new ship, and it was called the Vengeance, and it was nothing like the peaceful exploration vessel he had commanded 3 years ago. He was different now, and the hopeful explorer was gone, and in his place stood a warrior who had been forged in grief and rage, and who would not rest until justice was served. Lieutenant Park Yuna stood beside him, and she had changed too, and there was steel in her eyes that had not been there before, and she was ready to fight for the friends she had lost. All ships report ready, said Commander Yoon Seung-ho, and he was the tactical officer, and he had trained for this moment every single day. Since the massacre, Dae-sung opened a channel to every ship in the fleet, and his voice reached thousands of warriors who were ready to write a new chapter in human history. 3 years ago, he said, and they killed our people, and they laughed about it, and they forgot about us, but we did not forget. We are humanity, and we are coming for them, and we will teach them why our ancestors feared the dark. The first fleet jumped to faster than light, and the stars blurred and stretched, and then they were gone, and behind them, Earth continued to build, because the first wave was only the beginning. Silence was over. The thunder was coming. Nexus Prime was the beating heart of the Galactic Council military, and it was a fortress world that had never been conquered, and it housed the largest fleet in the known universe, and everyone believed it was completely invincible. High Admiral Cortex commanded this legendary fleet, and he was a warrior who had won more than 100 battles, and he had crushed rebellions and conquered worlds, and he had never known the bitter taste of defeat. When his sensors detected 200 alien ships emerging from faster than light travel, he felt only amusement and contempt, because these foolish creatures had come to die, and he would be happy to help them. The Council fleet at Nexus Prime numbered more than 1,000 warships, and they were huge and powerful, and they had weapons that could crack planets in half, and shields that could withstand almost anything. Commander Yoon Seung-ho stood at the center of the Vengeance command deck, and he studied the enemy formation on his tactical display, and he counted their ships and calculated the odds, and then he smiled. They outnumber us 5-1, he said to Captain Dae-sung, and his voice was calm and almost casual, like he was discussing the weather. Dae-sung nodded, and his face showed no fear, because he had trained for this moment, and he trusted his ships and his people, and he knew what humanity was capable of when pushed to the edge. Communications Officer Shin Minji turned from her station, and her voice was professional and steady, even though her heart was racing with anticipation. Sir, she said, and the enemy flagship is hailing us, and they are demanding our immediate and unconditional surrender. Seung-ho and Dae-sung exchanged a look, and something passed between them that needed no words, and then Seung-ho nodded. Open the channel, he said. Main view screen flickered, and High Admiral Cortex appeared, and his insectoid face was twisted with what looked like mockery, and his mandibles clicked as he spoke in a language that the human computers translated instantly. Primitive creatures, said Cortex, and his voice dripped with arrogance and superiority. You come here to my fortress with your pitiful little ships and your pathetic weapons, and you think you can challenge the might of the Galactic Council. He laughed, and it was an ugly sound that grated on the ears of every human listening. You are outnumbered and outgunned, and you have no hope of survival, and I will give you one chance to surrender and beg for a quick death. Seung-ho let him finish, and he did not interrupt, and he did not show any emotion, because he wanted the alien to feel confident and superior. Admiral, he said, and his voice was quiet and controlled, and there was something dangerous hiding beneath the surface. I am going to give you one chance, and one chance only, and I suggest you listen very carefully, because I will not repeat myself. Surrender your fleet now, and accept our terms, and your crews will be allowed to live, and this battle does not have to happen. Cortex stared at the human on his screen, and he could not believe what he was hearing, and he thought perhaps these creatures had some kind of mental deficiency. You dare," he snarled, and his mandibles clicked rapidly with rage. And his compound eyes burned with fury. "Your fleet is outnumbered 5-1, and my ships are superior in every way. And you stand at the gates of the most powerful fortress in the galaxy, and you demand my surrender." He leaned forward, and his voice became a hiss of pure contempt. "Fire all weapons and destroy these insects." Council fleet opened fire, and the darkness of space was lit up by thousands of plasma bolts and missiles and energy beams, and it was a wall of destruction that should have annihilated the human ships in seconds. But the human ships were not where the weapons expected them to be. They moved in ways that the Council targeting computers could not predict, and they twisted and spun and danced through the incoming fire with impossible grace and speed. The aliens had never seen anything like it, and their weapons struck empty space again and again, and they could not understand how the primitive human ships were evading their advanced targeting systems. And then the humans fired back. The first human volley punched through Council shields like they were made of thin paper, and ships that had survived 100 battles exploded in brilliant flashes of light, and crews that had never known defeat died without understanding what had happened. And Sung-Ho watched his tactical display, and he gave orders with calm precision, and he moved his ships like pieces on a chessboard, and every move was calculated, and every attack was devastating. The Council ships tried to regroup and form defensive formations, but the humans were too fast and too coordinated, and they struck from unexpected angles and exploited weaknesses that the aliens did not even know they had. Captain Kim Dae-sung led a squadron of 15 ships directly into the heart of the enemy formation, and they cut through the Council fleet like a hot knife through butter, and they left trails of destruction in their wake. He thought about the Meridian as he fired, and he remembered the faces of the people who had died, and each enemy ship he destroyed felt like justice being served. Lieutenant Park Yuna coordinated the fleet communications, and she tracked enemy movements and called out targets, and her voice was steady and professional. Even as chaos erupted around her, General Han Taejin commanded the marine boarding parties, and his soldiers stormed enemy vessels and fought in close quarters, and they showed no mercy because they had been shown none. The Council crews had never faced enemies like this, and they had grown soft after 12,000 years of easy victories, and they did not know how to fight opponents who refused to give up. Cortex watched his fleet being torn apart, and his confidence crumbled, and his mandibles hung loose with shock, and he screamed orders that no one could follow because everything was happening too fast. "How is this possible?" he shrieked, and his voice was filled with terror and disbelief. "We are the masters of this galaxy, and we have conquered hundreds of species, and these primitives cannot be defeating us." But they were defeating him, and the evidence was everywhere. On his tactical display, where green friendly dots were disappearing one after another. The battle lasted 4 hours, and when it was finally over, the Council Grand Fleet was nothing but scattered debris and broken hulls, and the bodies of aliens floated through space among the wreckages. Sung-Ho looked at the destruction on his screen, and he felt satisfaction but not joy. Because this was not a celebration, and this was justice, and justice was cold and hard. He opened the broadcast on all Council frequencies, and he knew that his words would be heard across thousands of worlds and by billions of aliens who had thought themselves safe. "This message is for the Galactic Council," he said, and his voice was calm and steady. 3 years ago, you attacked our peaceful exploration fleet without warning and without mercy, and you killed our people, and you laughed about it. You thought we were weak, and you thought we would be easy prey, and you thought you could murder us without consequences. You were wrong. He paused and let the silence stretch across the void. "And now there is something you need to understand." That was only the first wave across the galaxy. Council members heard those words, and they felt real fear for the first time in 12,000 years, and they looked at each other with wide, horrified eyes. The humans had destroyed their greatest fleet with only 200 ships, and there were more waves coming. The great chamber of the Galactic Council had stood for 12,000 years, and it had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, and it had seen empires crumble and species go extinct, but it had never known true fear until now. High Councilor Viorin stood at the center of the massive chamber, and holographic displays surrounded him, showing footage of the Battle of Nexus Prime playing over and over, and each time he watched his fleet die, a little piece of his sanity crumbled away. The other council members sat in their elevated seats, arranged in a great circle around the chamber, and they were silent and pale, and their eyes were fixed on the destruction unfolding before them. "This cannot be real," whispered Councilor Meridia of the Veth people, and her voice was barely audible, and her 4 arms trembled as she watched another council warship explode on the display. "The Grand Fleet was supposed to be invincible," she said, "and it was the most powerful military force in the entire galaxy, and now it is gone, and it was destroyed by creatures we dismissed as primitive." Esfram wanted to scream at her and tell her to be quiet, but he could not speak, because his throat had closed up with fear and his mandibles clicked uselessly as he tried to form words. Senior Analyst Korath stepped forward nervously, and his long, thin legs wobbled as he approached the center of the chamber, and he carried a data tablet that contained information that would terrify everyone present. "High Counselor," he said, and his voice shook with fear because he knew his report would not be well received. "We have completed our analysis of the human species, and I must tell you that we made a catastrophic error in judgment." Vren finally found his voice, and it came out as a harsh rasp. "What do you mean error?" he demanded, and his compound eyes blazed with a mixture of rage. And Torokarith pulled up new holographic displays, and they showed images and videos from human history, and the council members leaned forward to watch despite their fear. "When we first encountered the humans, we assumed their primitive technology meant they were a weak and insignificant species," he explained. "We did not bother to study their history or their culture or their psychology, and this was a mistake that may cost us everything." Displays showed scene after scene of human conflict, and there were ancient battles fought with swords and spears, and there were modern wars fought with tanks and aircraft, and there were mushroom clouds rising over devastated cities. "They have been fighting each other since the beginning of their existence," said Korath, and his voice grew stronger as the data supported his words. "They have spent their entire history perfecting the art of warfare and developing new weapons and new tactics and new strategies." The council members watched humans charge into hopeless battles against overwhelming odds, and they saw humans refuse to surrender, even when all logic said they should. And they saw humans snatch victory from the jaws of defeat again and again. "They're not like other species we have conquered," said Korath, "and they do not give up when faced with superior force, and they do not accept defeat as inevitable." He paused and looked around the chamber at the frightened faces of the council members, and now, for the first time in their entire history, they are completely united, and they are united against us. The weight of those words hung in the air like a death sentence, and every being in the chamber understood what it meant. 8 billion humans working together with a single purpose, and that purpose was the destruction of the Galactic Council. The main display flickered, and a new image appeared, and it was a young human female with dark hair and cold, determined eyes, and she looked at the council with absolutely no fear. Ambassador Choi Yumbi had been chosen to deliver humanity's message, and she had been selected because she was brilliant and fearless, and her voice carried the fury of her entire species. "High Counselor Viorin," she said, and her voice echoed through the silent chamber. "Humanity has authorized me to deliver the following demands, and you will listen carefully, and you will not interrupt." Vren wanted to protest and assert his authority, but something in her eyes made him stay silent, and he realized with horror that he was afraid of this tiny creature. "First," said Yumbi, and she held up one finger. You will pay full reparations for the unprovoked attack on our peaceful exploration fleet, and you will compensate the families of every human you murdered. Second, and she raised another finger, you will immediately release all species currently held in slavery throughout Council territory, and every chain will be broken and every cage will be opened. Third, and her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, you, High Counselor Viorn, will surrender yourself personally to face trial for war crimes against humanity. The chamber erupted in shocked gasps and angry murmurs, and Viorn felt his legs go weak beneath him because no one had ever spoken to him this way. You cannot be serious, he stammered, and his voice had lost all its former authority and confidence. The Council has ruled this galaxy for 12,000 years, and we do not bow to primitive species, and we do not surrender to anyone. By smiled, and it was not a friendly smile, and it was the smile of someone who held all the power and knew exactly how to use it. You have 72 hours to accept our terms, she said, and her voice was final and absolute. Our second wave will arrive in 74 hours, and I strongly suggest you spend the time between now and then very wisely. The transmission ended, and the chamber fell into chaos. And council members shouted and argued, and some of them wept, and the fear was so thick in the air it was almost visible. How many waves do they have? Asked Councilor Meridia, and her voice cracked with desperation. No one could answer her because no one knew, and that uncertainty was more terrifying than anything else. Vren stood alone in the center of the chamber, and he felt the weight of every accusation and every stare, and he knew this was all his fault. He had ordered the attack on the human fleet, and he had dismissed them as insignificant, and he had laughed about their deaths. And now his arrogance was going to destroy everything the council had built. The hours crawled by slowly, and the council debated endlessly, but everyone knew there was really only one option, and pride was the only thing keeping them from accepting it. And then 74 hours passed, and 340 human warships appeared in council space, and they were bigger and more powerful than the first wave, and they carried enough firepower to level planets. Vren looked at the tactical display, and he saw the human fleet spreading out like a net, closing around prey, and he finally understood that resistance was pointless. Reached for his communication device with trembling hands, and he prepared to do something that no High Counselor had done in 12,000 years. He prepared to surrender. The surrender ceremony took place on the council homeworld, and it was broadcast to every corner of the galaxy, and trillions of beings watched as the most powerful empire in known space knelt before the species that had tried to exterminate. High Counselor Viorn was brought before Admiral Beak Jisu in chains, and his once proud posture was broken, and his compound eyes were dull with defeat, and he looked like a creature who had lost everything. The Admiral stood on a raised platform, and she wore her dress uniform, and her medals gleamed in the light, and behind her stood the commanders who had led humanity to victory. General Han Taejin was there, and his face was hard and unforgiving because his soldiers had liberated 4 enslaved worlds, and they had seen horrors that would haunt them forever. Captain Kim Daesung stood at attention, and his eyes never left Viorn, because this was the creature who had ordered the deaths of his friends, and he had waited 3 years for this moment. Lieutenant Park Yuna was beside him, and tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling because justice had finally been served, and the souls of the fallen could rest. Vren was forced to his knees before the Admiral, and he looked up at her with hatred and despair, and his mandibles clicked weakly as he tried to speak. "You have destroyed everything," he said, and his voice was hollow and empty. 12,000 years of civilization and 12,000 years of progress, and you have torn it all down. A matter of months. Admiral Beak looked down at him, and she felt no pity because she remembered the footage of the Meridian exploding, and she remembered the screams of dying humans. "No," she said, and her voice was cold and clear. "We have not destroyed civilization, and we have ended tyranny. And there is a very important difference. The Crowds that had gathered cheered, and they were made up of dozens of different species who had lived under council oppression for generations, and they had been slaves and prisoners and victims. Now they were free. In the weeks and months that followed, the galaxy transformed in ways that no one could have predicted, and the old order was swept away, and something new and better rose in its place. The Galactic Council was officially dissolved, and its corrupt leaders were put on trial for their crimes, and many of them were found guilty, and they faced consequences for the first time in their long lives. Enslaved species were liberated across thousands of worlds, and the chains were broken, and the cages were opened, and beings who had known nothing but suffering finally tasted freedom. Many of these newly freed species chose to ally themselves with humanity, and they saw in their liberators something they had never encountered before, and it was strength combined with compassion. The humans could have become conquerors, and they could have built their own empire on the ashes of the council, but they chose a different path, and that choice defined their legacy. A new galactic assembly was formed, and it was built on principles that humanity had learned through centuries of struggle, and it represented all species equally and protected the rights of every being, freedom and justice and opportunity for all, and protection for those who could not protect themselves. And these were the foundations of the new galactic order. Humanity stood at the center of this new civilization, but not as rulers and not as masters. Instead, they became guardians and protectors, and they used their power to help others. Captain Kim Dae-sung was promoted and given command of a new ship called the New Dawn, and it was the first vessel of a rebuilt exploration fleet, and it carried scientists and diplomats just like the old days. But this time, there were also warriors aboard, because humanity had learned that peace must sometimes be defended, and that kindness without strength could lead to tragedy. Lieutenant Park Yuna served as his first officer, and she had grown so much since that terrible day when everything changed, and she still believed in the dream of peaceful exploration. Do you think anyone will try to stop us this time? She asked as they prepared for their first mission into uncharted space. Destin smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he had worn in years, because he finally felt hope again, and he finally believed that the future could be bright. Let them try, he said, and there was no fear in his voice, because he knew what humanity could accomplish. The New Dawn launched into the unknown, and it carried humanity's oldest dream, which was to explore the universe and make friends among the stars. And this time, they were ready for whatever they might find back on Earth. The reconstruction continued, and people worked to build a better future, and they remembered the fallen, but they did not let grief consume them. Ambassador Choi Yoonbi addressed the first session of the new Galactic Assembly, and representatives from hundreds of species filled the Great Hall, and they listened in respectful silence. "We did not ask for this war," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the chamber. "We came to the stars seeking friends, and instead, we found enemies who tried to destroy us without reason or mercy. But when they struck at us, they awakened something they did not understand, and something that has been forged in the fires of countless struggles." She paused and looked around at the assembled delegates, and she saw hope in their eyes where once there had been only fear. "Humanity does not fight for territory or power or resources," she continued. "We fight for each other, and we fight for those who cannot fight for themselves, and we fight for what is right and just. There is no force in this universe that can defeat that spirit." The chamber was silent, and every being present felt the truth of her words, and they understood that the galaxy had changed forever. "So, here is our promise to this assembly," she said, and her voice rang out like a bell. "Humanity will protect the innocent, and we will stand against tyranny wherever it rises, and we will be the shield that guards those who cannot guard themselves." She paused, and her eyes hardened with determination. "And to anyone who would threaten the peaceful beings of this galaxy, remember Nexus Prime, and remember the first wave, and remember that we have barely begun to show you what humanity can do. The assembly erupted in applause, and the sound echoed through the halls. And it was the sound of hope being reborn on a quiet hill, overlooking the place where the first fleet had been constructed. A memorial stood, and it bore the names of the 108 humans who had died at first contact, carved into the stone. At its base were words that would be remembered for eternity: from the void we came, and to the void we shall bring justice. And across the galaxy, beings looked up at the stars, and they no longer saw darkness and cold and danger. They saw hope, because the humans were out there watching and protecting, and they would never let tyranny rise again. The war was over, but the story of humanity among the stars was just beginning, and it would be a story of courage and compassion and the unbreakable spirit of a species that refused to be broken. And that was the greatest victory of all.